Imagine being so powerful that you don't need a superweapon. You don't need a battle station. You don't need a fleet. You just wake up hungry, and a planet dies. That's Darth Nihilus, the Lord of Hunger. A Sith Lord so conceptually terrifying that he makes every Disney-era villain look like a Saturday morning cartoon character with a laser pointer. And here's the thing that should make every Star Wars fan's eye twitch. Disney bought him. They own him. They've owned him since October 30th, 2012, when they paid $4.05 billion for Lucasfilm. And in the decade plus since, across 3 sequel films with a combined production budget exceeding $700 million, they've used him exactly 0 times. Instead, they gave us the Death Star, again, and again, and again. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I present to you the case of Creative Malpractice versus the Walt Disney Company. The evidence is overwhelming. The defendant had access to the most terrifying villain concept in Star Wars history, and chose to bring back the guy who fell down a reactor shaft in 1983. I cannot stress this enough. They chose Palpatine. Let me walk you through the prosecution's case. Exhibit A begins on December 6, 2004, when Obsidian Entertainment released Star Wars, Knights of the Old Republic 2, The Sith Lords, for Xbox. The development was rushed. LucasArts pressured the team to hit a holiday window, and the game shipped incomplete. Modders would spend years restoring cut content through the Restored Content Mod project starting in 2009. But even in its compromised state, KOTOR II introduced antagonists so philosophically sophisticated, so narratively ambitious, that they've haunted Star Wars fans ever since. Among them was Darth Nihilus. His origin story is simple, horrifying, but simple. The Battle of Malachor V occurred in 3960 BBY as the final engagement of the Mandalorian Wars. The Mandalorian Neo-Crusaders, led by Mandalore the Ultimate, had launched a devastating invasion that the Republic military couldn't contain. The Jedi Council refused to sanction Jedi involvement, a decision that led Jedi Knights Revan and Malak to defy the Council and lead a faction of Jedi into battle anyway. 4 years of war built toward this final confrontation. A gravitational superweapon called the Mass Shadow Generator was activated by Jedi General Mitra Surik on orders from Revan. The weapon created an artificial gravity vortex that crushed both Mandalorian and Republic fleets simultaneously. 10,000 combatants died in an instant. The planet's surface was devastated into a fractured wasteland of floating debris. But the real damage was invisible. The simultaneous deaths of thousands of Force-sensitive beings created what Jedi called a wound in the Force, a localized tear in reality itself that would persist for millennia. The man who would become Darth Nihilus was there. We don't know his name. We don't know his homeworld. Sources can't even confirm if he was human. What we know is that he survived the event and emerged fundamentally broken. He developed an insatiable hunger for Force energy, not a metaphorical hunger, not a desire for power, actual physical hunger that consumed him from the inside out. His body began to deteriorate. Facing complete dissolution, he did the only thing he could. He bound his essence to his armor, his robes, his mask. He stopped being a person who used the Force. He became hunger given form, a wound in reality that fed to survive. His speech degraded beyond conventional language. He could only communicate through Force-transmitted concepts, requiring intermediaries to interpret his meaning. He was no longer recognizably human in any sense that mattered. And at some point, someone at Disney looked at this concept and said, "Nah, let's do Death Star again." But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me show you what Nihilus could do. The Katarr massacre occurred in 3952 BBY. The Jedi Council, trying to address mysterious Sith activity and unexplained Jedi deaths across the galaxy, convened a conclave on the planet Katarr. They chose Katarr because it was a colony world populated by the Miraluka, a near-human species who had evolved to perceive the world entirely through the Force rather than conventional sight. They had no eyes. They didn't need them. The entire planetary population was force-sensitive by biological necessity. Jedi Master Vandar Tokare and most of the Order's senior leadership attended the gathering. They came specifically to discuss the Sith threat, to pool their wisdom, to coordinate a response to the darkness spreading across the galaxy. They didn't realize they'd just rung the dinner bell. Darth Nihilus, drawn to the concentrated force presence like a predator to wounded prey, arrived at Katarr and activated his draining ability. Not on a building, not on a city, on the planet. His technique severed the connections between living beings and the Force, extracting their life energy as sustenance. The attack functioned continuously at low levels in his normal state, but proximity to high force concentrations triggered an intensified hunger response. A planet full of force-sensitive Miraluka, a gathering of the Jedi Order's most powerful masters. To Nihilus, it might as well have been a buffet with a neon sign. The entire planetary population, millions of people, died in a single feeding. Every Miraluka colonist, every attending Jedi Master, gone in moments. One survivor remained, Visas Mar, a Miraluka woman whom Nihilus kept as an apprentice. Her survival may have been intentional selection rather than failure of the technique. A pet, kept alive to serve. Everyone else? Lunch. I want you to sit with that for a moment. A Sith Lord got hungry and ate all life on a planet. No construction crews, no kyber crystal harvesting, no thermal oscillator weak points, no exhaust ports, just him, hungry. And Disney said, "We have better ideas." Let me show you those ideas. The Force Awakens arrived on December 18th, 2015. Directed by J.J. Abrams, written by Abrams, Lawrence Kasdan, and Michael Arndt. Production budget between $245 to $259 million. The film earned $2.068 billion worldwide, making it the highest-grossing Star Wars film ever. And at the center of its third act was Starkiller Base. What is Starkiller Base? It's the Death Star, but bigger. It's literally a Death Star built into a planet instead of a constructed battle station. It destroys planets by consuming a sun, draining stellar energy, and firing that energy across the galaxy. The Hosnian system, the New Republic capital, was destroyed, killing billions. Reviewers at The Guardian, Rolling Stone, and IO9 all noted the same thing. This feels repetitive. The 93% critic score and 86% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes suggested general satisfaction, but the specific criticisms about Starkiller Base's conceptual laziness planted seeds of concern. Maybe it's an homage, people said. Maybe they're establishing the First Order as a Death Star-obsessed remnant. Maybe the next film will try something different. The Last Jedi arrived on December 15th, 2017. Rian Johnson as director, with a production budget estimated between $200 to $317 million, depending on source. The film earned $1.333 billion worldwide. And to be fair, it didn't feature a traditional superweapon. The First Order's Supremacy Mega Star Destroyer served as the primary threat in what was essentially a fleet pursuit scenario. The 91% critic score suggested something worked. The 42% audience score suggested otherwise, indicating a significant disparity between critical assessment and audience reception that would define the sequel trilogy's legacy. But at least we weren't doing Death Star again, right? Right? The Rise of Skywalker arrived on December 20th, 2019. Directed by J.J. Abrams again. Written by Abrams and Chris Terrio. Production budget approximately $275 million. And here's where the prosecution rests its case on sheer absurdity. The film introduced the Zeiston-class Star Destroyer fleet, designated the Final Order. Each vessel measured 2,406 meters in length. Each was equipped with an axial superlaser capable of destroying planets, derived directly from Death Star technology. The fleet numbered in the thousands. Let me repeat that. Thousands of ships, each one a planet killer. This is what happens when you have no ideas. You just add zeros. One Death Star was threatening in 1977. Two Death Stars in 1983 was pushing it. One planet-sized Death Star in 2015 was concerning. And by 2019, the creative pitch meeting apparently went, what if Death Star, but as a standard ship configuration across an entire fleet? That's not imagination, that's multiplication. The film earned $1.074 billion worldwide, the lowest gross of the sequel trilogy by a significant margin. The critical reception hit 52% on Rotten Tomatoes, a drop of over 40 points from The Force Awakens' critical score. The creative bankruptcy was reflected in the returns, but the box office decline tells only part of the story, because it gets worse. The Rise of Skywalker also featured the return of Emperor Palpatine, portrayed again by Ian McDiarmid. His death in Return of the Jedi, the climactic moment of the original trilogy, Vader's redemption, the fall of the Empire, was retconned through some dialogue about cloning and dark side resurrection techniques. The guy who fell down a reactor shaft in 1983 was back, baby. Somehow, Palpatine returned. That's the actual line from the film. Somehow. That's the explanation we got. Somehow. And surrounding Palpatine on the hidden Sith world of Exegol, the Sith Eternal. Faceless, hooded figures, thousands of them, packed into a stadium-like arena, chanting in unison as their resurrected master proclaimed the final order's dominion. They had no names, no distinct philosophies, no narrative purpose beyond creepy backdrop for Palpatine's monologue. They were extras in robes, human set dressing for a villain who'd already died once and apparently learned nothing from the experience. Compare that to what KOTOR II gave us, the Sith Triumvirate. 3 Sith Lords, 3 completely different philosophies of evil. Darth Nihilus, hunger incarnate, consuming because he must, no longer capable of wanting anything beyond the next feeding. Darth Sion, a warrior sustained by pain and dark side rage despite a technically dead body, his flesh held together by sheer hatred, who could only be defeated by convincing him to stop wanting to live. And Darth Kreia, a former Jedi Master who had been exiled from the Order and subsequently embraced Sith philosophy, but whose goals transcended the petty power grabs of traditional Sith. The Triumvirate operated from the Treyas Academy on Malachor V, and in a development that surprised no one familiar with Sith politics, Nihilus and Sion eventually betrayed Kreia, stripping her of her Force connection and exiling her from the Academy. Because that's what Sith do. That's how their ideology works. The rule of two exists because Sith inevitably turn on each other, and KOTOR II made that dysfunction the engine of its plot. Disney's Sith Eternal? They just stood there, chanting, waiting for Rey to show up and cross her lightsabers. The Triumvirate were broken monsters, with competing visions of what the dark side meant. The Sith Eternal were crowd noise. One approach creates villains you remember for decades. The other fills stadium seats in a CGI underground cavern. And here's the punchline. The moment that crystallizes everything wrong with this creative direction. During the climax of The Rise of Skywalker, Palpatine unleashes Force lightning against Rey and Ben Solo. The most powerful Sith Lord in galactic history returned from death, channeling all his dark side energy into a devastating attack on the hidden Sith world of Exegol. The Final Order fleet of planet-killing star destroyers waits in the wings. The galaxy's last hope stands before absolute darkness. And how is Palpatine defeated? Rey crosses 2 lightsabers in front of her. The lightning reflects back at him. His physical form is destroyed. That's it. 2 lightsabers, held like an X, and the ultimate evil is neutralized. The reflected energy destroys him. The Final Order fleet is subsequently disabled when the command signal from Exegol is severed. Resistance and citizen fleet forces mop up the disoriented vessels. Sith, then. I Hungi, and an entire planet of Force-sensitive beings dies in moments. Sith now. Force lightning that gets blocked by 2 crossed lightsabers. This is the creative trajectory Disney chose. This is what $4.05 billion bought them access to, and what they decided to ignore. The prosecution presents its evidence. But wait, I promised fairness. The defense gets one moment. And I mean this genuinely. Starkiller Base was built on Ilum. This is actually a good idea. Ilum wasn't just any planet. It was a sacred site for the Jedi Order for millennia, one of the most important locations in Jedi spiritual practice. Jedi younglings traveled there to harvest kyber crystals for their lightsabers as part of a ritual called the Gathering. This wasn't just a supply run, it was a rite of passage. The caves of Ilum were a test. Younglings entered alone, facing visions and challenges that reflected their own fears and weaknesses. The Force would guide each youngling to a specific crystal, their crystal, the one that was meant for them. These crystals would eventually become the hearts of their lightsabers, resonating with their Force presence, becoming extensions of themselves. The Clone Wars animated series devoted an entire story arc to this ritual, showing younglings like Petro, Katuni, and Gungi undertaking the journey under Yoda's guidance. We watched children face their fears in those ice caves. We watched them emerge with the crystals that would define their lives as Jedi. The Galactic Empire occupied Ilum following Order 66. Kyber mining operations stripped the planet of its crystals, the same crystals that had once powered instruments of peace, to supply Death Star construction. The First Order continued this desecration, eventually converting the entire planet into Starkiller Base. The world where generations of Jedi found themselves became the weapon that destroyed the New Republic. The thematic weight here is genuine. It's not just destruction, it's desecration. The First Order literally hollowed out a Jedi holy site to build their weapon. The crystals that guided younglings through their fears now powered a weapon of genocide. That's creative. That's meaningful. That's the kind of dark irony that gives a superweapon emotional resonance. But here's the thing. The film doesn't really explore this. It's mentioned in supplementary material. It's in the visual dictionary. It's in behind-the-scenes content. The average viewer watching The Force Awakens has no idea they're looking at the corpse of a place where children once went to find their purpose. The good idea exists, but it's not in the storytelling. It's trivia for fans who buy the companion books. And even if they'd explored it fully, even if they'd made Ilum's desecration a central emotional beat, shown Rey or Finn or someone discovering what this weapon used to be, imagine if they'd combined that concept with something like Nihilus. Imagine a sequel trilogy villain who doesn't need a planet-killing weapon because he is one, who represents not technological terror, but something far worse, an inevitability. A hunger that grows stronger the more Jedi gather to oppose it. You can't shoot him. You can't blow up his thermal oscillator. You can't disable his command signal. You can only hope you're not nearby when he gets hungry. Imagine the thematic possibilities. A villain who represents what the dark side truly is, not power, not control, but consumption. A being so far gone that he's no longer recognizable as human, bound to his mask and armor, existing as a spirit anchored to physical objects rather than a living creature. A threat that can't be solved with X-Wings or crossed lightsabers. The horror with Nihilus is existential. His hunger operated continuously at low levels, requiring periodic, large-scale feeding to sustain his existence. He didn't choose to destroy Katarr. He needed to. And the hunger only grew. Left unchecked, sources suggest he could potentially consume all life in the galaxy, not through malice, but through appetite. He was the logical endpoint of the dark side's consuming nature made literal. That's what was sitting in the vault. That's what Disney decided wasn't worth using. Let me tell you about the creative benchmarks they inherited, because Nihilus wasn't an anomaly. The whole Legends era was operating at a different level. The Starforge was introduced in the original KOTOR, released by BioWare on July 15, 2003, for Xbox, with a PC release following on November 19th. The game sold approximately 3.2 million copies across platforms and swept multiple Game of the Year awards. It proved audiences would embrace Star Wars stories set thousands of years before the Skywalker saga, with entirely new characters and threats that had never appeared in film. The Starforge wasn't just a weapon. It was built by the Rakata species, also known as the Builders, during the height of their infinite empire, with construction dating to approximately 30,000 BBY. The station orbited their homeworld Lahan in the unknown regions, drawing energy from a nearby star and channeling dark-side power to manufacture warships, droids, weapons, and armor at rates unprecedented in galactic history. But here's what made it conceptually brilliant. The Starforge fed on its users. The station created a symbiotic relationship with whoever controlled it, drawing on their dark side energy while providing them unlimited military production capability. Sources describe fleets of capital ships produced in days rather than years, war material at industrial scales without requiring conventional raw materials. But prolonged use intensified the dark side corruption of its operators, creating a feedback loop of power and degradation. The more you used it, the more it consumed you. The more it consumed you, the more you needed it. The Rakata civilization eventually collapsed approximately 25,000 BBY, following a plague that stripped them of their force sensitivity, rendering the Starforge inaccessible. The weapon outlived its masters. It sat dormant for millennia, waiting for someone force-sensitive enough to reactivate it, to feed it again. Darth Revan rediscovered it in 3,956 BBY. After being captured by the Jedi, mind-wiped, and retrained without knowledge of his former identity, Revan traced the Starforge to Lahan and ultimately confronted Darth Malak, his former apprentice who had usurped control of the Sith forces. The canonical light-side ending establishes that Revan destroyed the facility, ending its millennia-long threat. This is what creative superweapon design looks like. It wasn't just bigger explosion. The Starforge had mechanics. It had costs. It had philosophical implications about the nature of power and corruption. It served you while consuming you. Using it was a Faustian bargain that generations of Star Wars fans debated in forums and fan discussions. Nihilus emerged from this tradition, a superweapon that doesn't require construction because it walks, a threat that grows stronger when confronted. And here's the crucial detail that separates Legends storytelling from Disney's approach. Defeating these villains required narrative specificity, not convenient weak points. Darth Nihilus received his Sith training from Darth Kreia. And this is where we need to talk about Kreia, because she represents everything Disney's sequel trilogy abandoned in its rush back to good guys versus bad guys. Kreia was a former Jedi Master who had taught Revan before his fall. She was exiled from the Jedi Order for her unorthodox views, specifically her growing belief that the Force itself was the problem. Not the dark side, not the Sith, the Force, all of it. She argued that the Force's will stripped sentient beings of true free will, that both Jedi and Sith were slaves to a cosmic power that manipulated events for its own unknowable purposes. Her ultimate goal wasn't to rule the galaxy or destroy the Republic. She wanted to kill the Force itself, to create a galaxy where beings could choose their own destinies without mystical interference. Think about that for a moment. A Star Wars villain whose philosophical position was, the whole light side versus dark side conflict is a trap, and the only way to be truly free is to end the game entirely. She didn't want power. She wanted liberation from a system she saw as cosmic slavery. KOTOR II let players argue with her, for hours, through dialogue trees that branched and evolved based on your choices. She would challenge your assumptions, pick apart your reasoning, force you to defend positions you'd taken for granted since you first saw A New Hope. She made players question whether the Jedi were actually good, whether the Force deserved reverence, whether the entire franchise's moral framework was built on comfortable lies. Disney's sequel trilogy gave us light side versus dark side, good versus evil, resistance versus first order. Palpatine wants power because he's evil. Rey is good because she's a Palpatine who chose differently. The moral complexity of a game that shipped incomplete in 2004 exceeded the philosophical ambition of 3 feature films with combined budgets exceeding $700 million. And Kreia trained Nihilus. She looked at a being of pure consumption and saw a weapon against the Force itself. If Nihilus could drain all life in the galaxy, all Force-sensitive beings, perhaps the Force would finally die. She created a monster to end a god. That's not a villain. That's a thesis statement about the nature of destiny and free will, wrapped in Sith robes. Speaking of connections that actually meant something, let's talk about Force bonds. The Rise of Skywalker made a significant deal about the dyad in the Force between Rey and Kylo Ren. Two beings connected across space, able to see each other, touch each other, even transfer physical objects between their locations. The film used this connection to teleport a lightsaber during a climactic duel. It was, charitably, a plot convenience that looked cool. Less charitably, it was a narrative get-out-of-jail-free card that could solve any problem the writers needed solved. KOTOR II built its entire game around Force bonds. The Jedi exile, Meetra Surik, had severed her own connection to the Force as a survival mechanism following the Malachor V trauma. But that severance didn't make her immune to connection. It made her connections parasitic. She unconsciously formed Force bonds with her companions, and through those bonds, she influenced their development, sometimes toward redemption, sometimes toward corruption, depending on player choice. Kreia explicitly identified this ability as dangerous. The exile could turn others into extensions of herself without realizing it. The bond between the exile and Kreia was the game's central relationship. Teacher and student, manipulator and weapon. Two wounded beings circling each other, each convinced they were using the other for their own purposes. When Kreia was hurt, the exile felt it. When the exile grew stronger, Kreia fed on that strength. Their connection wasn't romantic destiny, it was trauma bonding given Force mechanics. Nihilus existed within this framework too. He was a wound in the Force that consumed connection rather than forming it. He was the dark mirror of what the exile could become if she stopped fighting the hunger. The game used these bonds to explore what it meant to survive trauma, to carry others' pain, to influence people without their consent. Disney used the dyad to teleport a lightsaber. One approach treats Force connections as metaphors for human relationships, their intimacy, their danger, their capacity to heal or destroy. The other approach treats them as a cool visual effect that solves third-act plot problems. The Lord of Hunger answered to no one. His flagship, the Ravager, a vessel held together more by his will than by structural integrity, became his mobile throne. He drifted through the galaxy, following concentrations of Force energy, feeding when the hunger demanded it. Nihilus was defeated in 3,951 BBY aboard the Ravager. The Jedi exile Meetra Surik, accompanied by companions potentially including Visas Marr and Mandalore, depending on player choices, boarded the vessel for the confrontation. And here's what matters. Surik proved partially resistant to Nihilus's draining ability, because she was also a wound in the Force, created by the same Malachor V trauma that had birthed him. She had survived by unconsciously severing her own connection to the Force, a survival mechanism that left her uniquely equipped to face a being who consumed that connection. You couldn't just find Nihilus's exhaust port. You needed someone who'd survived the same thing he had. The canonical ending establishes that Nihilus was destroyed through Visas Marr severing his connection to his mask anchor, or through Surik exploiting their shared wound nature. Either interpretation requires specific circumstances, specific people, specific Force conditions, not two crossed lightsabers held like an X. The storytelling implications are profound. Nihilus's defeat came from understanding what he was and finding the one person in the galaxy equipped to counter it. It came from Visas Marr's journey, a survivor of Katarr who had served her people's murderer as an apprentice before turning against him. It came from the philosophical framework KOTOR II had built across dozens of hours of gameplay about the nature of the Force, trauma, and survival. Disney had access to this. They owned it. And on April 25, 2014, they declared it didn't count anymore. Lucasfilm announced that the expanded universe, comprising decades of novels, comics, and games, including both KOTOR titles, would be rebranded as Legends, and would not be considered canonical to future Star Wars productions. Only the 6 theatrical films, the Clone Wars animated series, and future Disney-produced content would constitute official canon. Darth Nihilus was officially relegated to not real anymore. There was a moment of hope. a brief flicker. On March 30th, 2016, Star Wars Rebels Season 2 aired its two-part finale, Twilight of the Apprentice. The episode, directed by Dave Filoni and written by Stephen Melching, Henry Gilroy, and Simon Kinberg, featured a Sith temple on the planet Malachor. Yes, that Malachor. The planet where the mass shadow generator created wounds in the Force and birthed monsters like Nihilus. The temple contained visual references to ancient Sith, and fans immediately identified Darth Nihilus.His distinctive mask among the displayed artifacts. That white and red visage, unmistakable to anyone who'd played KOTOR II, sitting in a background shot of a Sith temple on the very planet where his story began. This was the first visual acknowledgement of Nihilus-adjacent imagery in Disney-era canonical material. The fandom held its breath. Maybe the Lord of Hunger would finally emerge from Legend's purgatory. Maybe this was the setup for something bigger. He did not emerge. The mask sat in a background shot, and that was it. An Easter egg. A wink to fans who remembered better storytelling, followed by nothing. The KOTOR remake was announced on September 9th, 2021, during a PlayStation showcase, with Aspire Media as developer. Hope sparked again. Maybe the Old Republic era would finally enter proper canon. Maybe we'd see these stories given the respect they deserved. Then, reports in July 2022 indicated the project had been delayed indefinitely following internal development issues. In June 2023, development transferred to Saber Interactive. As of 2024, no release date has been confirmed, and the project's status remains uncertain. And even if it ships, the remake adapts the first KOTOR game, which features the Starforge and Darth Malak, but not the Sith Triumvirate. Nihilus doesn't appear until KOTOR II. Any remake of his story remains hypothetical, years away at best, and subject to the same corporate uncertainties that have plagued the first game's adaptation. The Lord of Hunger waits, and waits, and waits. Meanwhile, the sequel trilogy concluded with crossed lightsabers defeating the returned Emperor. The Final Order fleet was neutralized when its command signal was cut. The galaxy was saved by a girl with 2 laser swords and a last-minute citizen uprising. So here's where we are. Disney purchased Lucasfilm for $4.05 billion. They gained access to a Sith Lord who ate planets because he was hungry. A villain who doesn't need a battle station because he is the battle station. A threat so conceptually terrifying that he makes Palpatine look like a parlor trick with lightning fingers. They inherited a legacy of creative superweapon design, the Starforge, the mass shadow generator, threats that had costs and mechanics and philosophical weight. They inherited Kreia, a villain who wanted to kill the Force itself because she believed free will was impossible while it existed. They made 3 sequel films. They gave us Starkiller Base, Death Star, but a planet. They gave us the Zeiston fleet, Death Star, but thousands of ships. They gave us Palpatine, the guy who died in 1983, back for one more reactor shaft fall, defeated by crossed lightsabers. They gave us the Sith Eternal, thousands of faceless cultists chanting in a stadium with no names, no philosophies, no purpose beyond creepy backdrop. The Force Awakens earned $2.068 billion. The Rise of Skywalker earned $1.074 billion. That's nearly $1 billion in audience erosion across a single trilogy. The numbers tell the story the executives apparently couldn't hear from the fans. Diminishing returns on diminishing creativity. The prosecution doesn't need to convince you that Disney made poor creative choices. You already know. You've known since you walked out of The Force Awakens with that nagging feeling that you'd seen this movie before. You've known since, somehow, Palpatine returned, became shorthand for lazy writing. You've known since 2 crossed lightsabers defeated the ultimate evil in a finale that cost $275 million to produce. What I'm providing is the receipts. The Legends content you championed for decades wasn't just nostalgia. It wasn't rose-colored glasses. It wasn't you had to be there. The KOTOR games represented a genuine creative peak in Star Wars storytelling. Villains with philosophical depth, superweapons with narrative costs, Threats that couldn't be solved with bigger explosions or convenient weak points. Games that shipped incomplete and still managed to produce more memorable antagonists than 3 feature films with unlimited budgets. Darth Nihilus is Exhibit A. The Starforge is Exhibit B. Kreia's war against the Force itself is Exhibit C. The Ilum to Starkiller tragedy, buried in supplementary material instead of explored on screen, is Exhibit D. And Death Star but Bigger 3, this time it's a fleet, is the prosecution's closing argument. You were right to remember these stories. You were right to argue for their value when people dismissed expanded universe content as not real Star Wars. You were right to feel that something was missing from the sequel trilogy, some ambition, some willingness to take creative risks with the mythology. So the next time someone tells you, Legends fans just can't let go, remind them of this. Disney had a Sith Lord who consumed all life on a planet because he was hungry. A being no longer recognizable as human, bound to his armor and mask, who communicated through Force concepts because language had failed him. A walking extinction event who required a uniquely qualified opponent to defeat. Not a thermal oscillator weakness, not a command signal to cut, but someone who had survived the same trauma that created him. They had a factory that built fleets while consuming the souls of its operators. They had a villain who wanted to murder the Force itself because she believed it was a cosmic tyrant. They had storytelling that treated superweapons as Faustian bargains rather than set pieces to be destroyed in third acts. They had Force bonds that explored trauma and influence rather than teleporting plot devices. And they gave us Palpatine falling down a reactor shaft. Again. The defense rests. The verdict is obvious. You were right all along. Subscribe for more stories like this.